The amount of clean energy that can be produced in our ocean environment is virtually limitless. And offshore wind is a really nice complement for solar and other onshore clean energy resources because it tends to produce the most when we're not getting energy from our solar resource base.
Another source of confusion around offshore wind is the quote-unquote newness of it. Yes, this is a new technology and industry in the US and New York, but it's not new on the global stage. The first offshore wind farm was built in Denmark in 1991. As of 2023, 19 countries now use offshore wind power, and there are about 12,000 operating turbines across the world. Welcome to Plugging In, powering our way to a brighter and healthier New York. I'm your host, Barry Wygel. Each episode on this podcast, we will discuss a different topic related to clean energy, explaining complex topics in a way you can understand. Become part of the community as we help to make a brighter and healthier New York.
As the sun crests on the horizon, a new day dawns in our state. A new hope for tomorrow is rising, a clean future we create. Tomorrow we breathe easier, tomorrow the skies are clear. Today we are plugging in, the future of New York is here.
Before we get into today's episode, I have a very quick favor to ask. If you're enjoying this podcast, please give us 5 stars on whatever platform you're listening on and leave a review. It is the #1 way we can grow. Thank you. Today, we're going to talk about how projects get built in New York and the rigorous permitting and approval process they face. And we have the perfect guest joining us today to talk about that. Fred Zalcman is the former director of the New York Offshore Wind Alliance with about a decade of experience in offshore wind and more than 35 years experience in clean energy. Fred, thanks for joining us today.
Absolutely. Thanks for inviting me, Barry.
All right, so we're going to build our theoretical project off the coast of New York. What are the first steps?
Well, the first steps really begin very early on with the Bureau of Ocean Energy Management.
That's the federal level, right?
Yep. Federal agency that's charged with responsibility for energy resources on the outer continental shelf. That's essentially the vast swath of ocean beyond the 3 mile of state jurisdictional water. So everything on the Atlantic Ocean, Pacific Ocean, Gulf of Mexico. Bureau of Ocean Energy Management is looking to exploit the wind resource potential, which is significant in the Northeast U.S., while at the same time minimizing any adverse consequences, be it for marine mammals. The military obviously has multiple assets out in the ocean protecting our coastline. There are navigational interests, so ensuring that the offshore wind farm doesn't interfere with the boats traversing the ocean, and multiple other human and wildlife uses, just making sure that whatever's developed out there is compatible with all these other uses. So BOEM convenes an interagency task force with, in this case, the state of New York, with other federal agencies, and identifies areas of the ocean that maximize the potential energy yield, but are also compatible with wildlife and economic and social uses of that space, and then ultimately put that up for auction. So that's really just the first step.
Yes, the first of many, many steps. So essentially, the federal government owns the quote-unquote land or space out there. They designate these zones or grids that are available to be built in, and then it's an auction process. Is that how developers get involved?
Correct. So once BOEM has identified a wind energy area, it will invite qualified developers, those with the financial resources and skill sets really to build what amounts to a massive infrastructure project in a hostile ocean environment. And so it will put these areas up for auction. Developers will then bid the price they're willing to pay essentially to the federal government, to the coffers of the U.S. Treasury over the life of the asset to secure the right to develop on the space. I should emphasize that it's just a right to develop. By leasing this property, it doesn't confer immediately a right on the developer. There still has to be numerous federal, state, local approvals before these projects come to fruition.
This is going to take a while to go through this process because we're just at the lease and you get the right to, it's your land. It's almost like an option, but you can't do anything yet. So then let's say we, successfully win our auction. We have the right to that space. What's next?
Well, what's next is the developer will put together a site assessment plan. Bear in mind that these are areas of the ocean environment that probably have never been studied before. So the developer will put together a comprehensive plan to look at, the number and frequency of marine mammals that may traverse through the lease area, characterize the physical environment, the geophysical condition of the lease area to ensure that you can properly site turbines in this environment. And the developer will also try to understand what is the wind resource out there. So they'll install what are called met buoys to look at the wind speed, how hard the wind blows, how often it blows, to give them a sense of the economic value of the site.
So that plan is very informational for the developer. Does that have to go to anyone for approval?
The plan for assessing the site is ultimately approved by BOEM, and it has to run through multiple federal agencies just to make sure that the developer is actually studying what people want to understand about the site.
Oh, so that's not even the completed plan. That's the plan to go make a plan?
Exactly.
Okay.
It's just the course of study. So then the developer will collect all this data, and that's all input ultimately for the developer's construction and operation plan, which is, as the name implies, how the developer will go about developing the site and operating the wind farm. And that is part of the federal environmental review process. Again, BOEM is the lead federal agency, but as the lead agency, BOEM coordinates and consults with all the relevant federal agencies, the Federal Aviation Administration, to ensure that the lights on the turbines are compatible with airline usage, over that airspace. National Oceanic and Atmospheric Association, looking at protecting marine mammals and other endangered species. Fish and Wildlife Federation. Army Corps of Engineers, which has to approve any infrastructure development in the ocean environment. So I believe there are some 25 state, federal, local permits required before a project essentially has the green light to proceed. So that's just the federal level. There's also a whole, in parallel, a state permitting regime, which we can talk about.
We will talk about it. So I know the auctions are only offered every so often, so it's hard to kind of gauge a timeline of a project, but how long, months or years, could it take from conception to lease auction to the site assessment plan and then the site assessment and then submitting your construction and operations plan?
It's a little bit mind-blowing. The life cycle of an offshore wind project is extremely long. I would say from the point of conception to shovels in the ground could be a decade or more. It's just,
wow.
Yeah.
Okay, I was expecting a lot, and that's more than I was expecting.
Yeah, I mean, I will say that based on experience in Europe, the construction is probably the easy part. New York and the federal government began laying the groundwork at this point now a decade ago. So we're starting to see the fruits of that labor. New York now has its first projects. There are other projects now serving Massachusetts, and there's a whole pipeline of projects that are starting to come through. So we're really starting to see offshore wind become a serious resource along the eastern seaboard.
Now we have our state permits and offtake, and which is probably separate, and then interconnection. How does that all work in New York?
In New York, NYSERDA, the New York State Energy Research and Development Authority, is responsible for incentivizing renewable energy development. And these projects will receive revenue from the wholesale market, just like any other generation source, but they are a nascent industry here in the U.S. and will require some incentives in the short term to make the economics pencil out. NYSERDA will periodically conduct what's called an OREC auction. That stands for Offshore Renewable Energy Credits. So the developers will essentially bid their resources, and the project that provides the lowest cost and the greatest value to ratepayers and the environment will gain the right to these incentives from NYSERDA. So that's the economic piece of the equation, but the state is also concerned to safeguard its environment, protect social equity and other concerns. So again, the state is responsible for everything onshore and 3 miles out in the ocean. So the state gets very involved in one aspect of the project where you're bringing the power from the wind farm to shore through so-called export cables. That's administered by the Department of Public Service. So that process itself will take anywhere from 1.5 years to 2 years, in parallel, of course, with the federal process.
So we've talked about these various processes that federal level, state level, some at the local level as well. I can't even count how many, government employees probably work on a project to evaluate and make sure that it successfully balances the public need for clean energy with the potential risks. So these projects aren't just popping up. Anyone who says that is misinformed, I would say.
No, that's absolutely correct. As I said, these projects are studied extensively, going way back before there even is a conception of a project.
And we've done and are planning many more episodes on the jobs that these projects will provide and the supply chain investments and all the economic benefits that come with these projects, not to even mention the clean power that we get. So one of the first questions I had ever asked you when I first met was, what is really the potential of offshore wind in New York?
The amount of clean energy that can be produced in our ocean environment is virtually limitless. And I think in New York right now, the biggest limiting factor is the ability of the New York grid to absorb this capacity. So in tandem with development of the offshore wind resource, and the state is definitely stepping up here, it is the need to accommodate this injection of significant clean energy capacity to the grid. And the state is authorizing those big investments. And offshore wind is a really nice complement for solar and other onshore clean energy resources because it tends to produce the most when we're not getting energy from our solar resource base. Just given the daily and seasonal production of offshore wind. So it can meet a significant part of New York's entire resource mix. I think the state's scoping plan as part of the Climate Action Council report indicates that, New York will receive upwards of 20 to 30% of its entire clean energy from offshore wind, and it can certainly provide more.
Yeah, that's excellent. And New York needs a lot of power and only need more and more as we go forward. So it's nice to have that option out there. Anything else you want to talk about?
I would just underscore, as you say, these projects don't just pop up. For good reason, they are extensively reviewed by all the agencies with an interest in the ocean environment for economic, environmental, national security, historic preservation reasons. The other stakeholder group that I didn't mention is the tribal nations, and those nations are consulted from the get-go, given that there are important archaeological sites that the offshore wind project may traverse. So, yeah, it's probably a resource that's studied like no other. So it's reassuring at the end of the day. When a project is approved, it has run all the traps, and it is providing a resource that's both clean and job producing and minimizes any potential adverse consequences.
Excellent. Well, I appreciate you taking us through the process. Fred Zalcman, thank you so much for joining us today.
Absolutely. Thank you, Barry.
Thank you for listening to this episode of Plugging In. I hope you learned something, and I hope you share this knowledge with someone else. It would be incredibly helpful if you leave us a 5-star review wherever you found this podcast. If there's a topic you would like us to cover in the future, or have a question about clean energy, send us an email at podcast@aceny.org. You can follow us on social media using the links in the show notes, or consider joining our Clean Energy Supporters mailing list at aceny.org/support. Your support is crucial to creating a brighter and healthier New York. I'll see you next time.
As the sun crests on the horizon, a new day dawns in our state. A new hope for tomorrow is rising, a clean future we create. Tomorrow we breathe easier, tomorrow the skies are clear. Today we are plugging in the future